The next question was, how are we going to mobilize for war? Wilson had said we are preparing a nation, not an army for war. So part of that is going to be propaganda to get the American people fully behind it, especially because we did not have a precipitating incident. The other part would be, how do we actually manufacture all of the weapons and all of the materials that need to be created in order to support the war effort? Because we're not just supporting us, we're also supporting our allies. There had already been a heavy demand when we were trying to trade with both Germany and England during this time, but now, because England and France are so exhausted, we are going to have to take the brunt of that organization. We also will be controlling and suppressing public opinion. This is one of the sketchier, probably big bonehead mistakes of Wilson, if we had to find his big bonehead mistake, if you're not counting that whole intervention in Latin America thing. No, he probably has a few big bonehead mistakes. But we are going to decide now, anybody who is against the war, who is speaking out against the war, would actually face legal consequences. Because remember, we had spent so much time telling people how we weren't going to go to war that now we are going to have to re-energize the American people. So who's going to pay for this? Well, the best option that the government always looks to is to raise taxes, so that will happen. Also, they will take out loans from banks, wealthy individuals. And the big one that you could do to prove that you were a good citizen would be to sell Liberty bonds. So interest-bearing certificates to certificates. This is essentially an IOU from the government. You're going to invest in the government and the faith that the government will be able to pay back this bond at a later date. It was your patriotic duty. It would be something fun that you could do with your friends, you know, go door to door, kind of like when you guys canvass for food drive, except you'd be selling Liberty bonds. But in order to do this, the economy had to be managed now in a different way. We were not going to be looking so much to create free competition anymore. We'd now spent all this time, remember, busting trusts and trying to create free competition, but now essentially the government is going to take over industry in order to dictate what the needs are to better serve our troops abroad. Wilson will create the Federal War Industry Board that will control pricing, the allocation of resources, and what had to be produced. So in other words, if you're a farmer and our guys needed potatoes, you would get your, marching orders from the Federal War Industry Board telling you how many you had to grow. Industry is going to thrive under this. So industry with the government regulation was true love. In other words, there was such a big market and everything had to be so specific, and the government was able to step in and do it, that industry was going to actually really thrive. There was also no competition because we had this market, and when you have such a specific set market, there didn't have to be competition. Everybody is going to have a job. Food supplies, the prices of the food supplies and farming were all controlled. We're also going to have something called the National War Labor Board. This is going to be sure that we don't have massive strikes during this time. So remember, we're still getting those labor unions, also known as organized labor, and now the War Labor Board will actually make some concessions to labor, basically saying, we will listen to you, we will be sure you are being paid a fair wage, and so on. No guarantees, but the fact that the federal government was actually creating a labor board was a big step. So the significance in all of this is a precedent, another one of those precedents for big government. More federal intervention into the private sphere. Previously, we had been actually trying to, under the laissez-faire system, there was no government intervention. The progressives started to encroach on that, but through guys like TR and Taft, who were going to, be trust busters, and tell businesses what they could and couldn't do in terms of trust, and also trying to have the power of unions rising. And now we're going to see the government completely take over the war economy, and it will serve as a precedent for big government. At the same time, this will be a moment for women and minorities. There will be more opportunities here for women and minorities, but it will not be forever. This is going to be a short-term thing because there will be continued inequalities. Women are going to take men's jobs, so we're quote-unquote men's jobs. They will go build airplanes, make ammunition on the assembly line. White women will have the most opportunity for this. They could even become managers. Black women, though, too, will have some new opportunities where they will actually be able to get a job on the assembly line. They will never have management positions, though. That still is not going to happen, unfortunately. And then, of course, our biggest moment, this is the time when we get the passage of that 19th Amendment. We get the passage, we have our right to vote, and women are going to use Wilson's argument about democracy abroad against him by saying, yeah, well, democracy starts at home, so give us the right to vote. So because we are going to have more African Americans working in factories, they're going to have to largely move to the factories. So remember that before we had African Americans still primarily living in the South, but our industrial jobs are going to be in the Northeast and even in the West. Military jobs are going to be mostly all be right up in here. Military and industrial jobs. So they will be able to escape lynching, which was still something going on in the South under the Jim Crow law, but they will not escape racism and segregation. In fact, and really unfortunately, the racism is going to be just as bad in the North, and we're going to have increased racial tensions that would culminate at times with race riots. New York City, for example, Harlem in 1905 was a white district. By 1925, it is going to be pretty much a segregated black district. So we're going to see blacks only going into certain areas of the city and facing a lot of discrimination there, especially housing discrimination. So I'd like you can turn and talk to your neighbor if you're all done at the same time, or you can just jot down some of your thoughts here. How did the U.S. government support the war effort? Go back and look through. What I'd like you to be sure you have in this answer is that it's your patriotic duty to buy bonds, the government takeover of industry, and propaganda. So propaganda is going to become a really big part of the war effort. The United States will create propaganda agencies. The biggest one will be the Committee on Public Information that will look to manipulate and shape public opinion that supported the war. They will have posters that will come out, and they will be plastered all over the place. I always like this one. Free speech doesn't mean careless talk. So this idea of what does it actually mean to have freedom of speech, this idea that we could have German spies here at home looking for pieces of information, and if you were careless, if your son was abroad and you had some piece of information and you carelessly spoke about it, you could be undermining the war effort. Help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. The Kaiser, of course, the Kaiser of Germany. To buy U.S. government bonds and appeal then to our patriotism to invest in the war effort. This was going to be a really key point because we didn't have that precipitating incident. And before this, like I said, I keep repeating it over and over, but I'm going to keep repeating it because it's so important. We didn't have that precipitating incident. Wilson had gone out of his way to calm us all down, and now he's going to have to make these academic arguments for freedom of speech and get us all riled up. So what do you do then when you have people who are like, yeah, I'm not buying this? Dissent is someone who disagrees, right? I respectfully dissent. That is not my opinion. But in this context of World War I, dissent is going to come to mean disloyalty. It doesn't actually mean that, but that's how it's going to be perceived. And at the end of the war, the United States is going to pass two acts. The first one is the Espionage Act, and it had very vague wording that basically says there would be suppression of dissent and criticism of the war and the war effort. This was a vague one, so the Sedition Act was added to it in 1918 that gave penalties for speaking out against anything war-related. So two really serious acts that are passed that limit our First Amendment rights. And the scariest thing about this is that when World War I ends, they aren't immediately repealed. In fact, we still have the Sedition Act today, or a portion, a part of the Sedition Act today. This will immediately be tested in a case called Schenck versus the United States in 1919. This is actually after the war is over. There was a man named Charles Schenck. He was a socialist. He was against the war and the war effort, and he distributed anti-war flyers to men who had been drafted for World War I. This goes straight to the Supreme Court, and it is tried under the Espionage Act. The court ruled in favor of the U.S. government and against Charles Schenck. They said that words can create clear and present danger that Congress may prohibit. An example from the brief was that you can't yell fire in a crowded building if there is no fire. So that's actually not an official rule, but that's just an example, that would be a violation of freedom of speech, because it would cause panic. It would be intentionally to cause panic. So you can't do and say something that causes panic intentionally to hurt people. Because if you yell fire in a crowded building and you knew there was no fire and everybody rushes to the door, there could be mass panic, people could get trampled to death, and then your First Amendment would not hold. Your First Amendment's rights wouldn't hold. So in this case, they said these words that were against World War I created a clear and present danger by essentially making people against the war, and Congress could prohibit it. Essentially, it limits your freedom of speech.